Howdy folks, welcome back to the Stick Figure Historian. We're still working on the American series, but before I get started, we need to review a mistake I made in last week's episode. Ahem. Cue the clip, please. After 2 relatively tranquil years of living amongst these professed separatists, Roger decided to migrate back north. He and Mary packed their few belongings, bundled up their newly born daughter, whom they had named Mary after her sweet mother, and started down the dirt trail leading out of Plymouth. William Brewster, the governor, gave the little family a warm farewell and good wishes for their journey. Okay, now what I should have said was William Bradford, not William Brewster. William Brewster was a preacher in the Plymouth colony. William Bradford was the governor. 2 Williams, 2 different guys. So, just clarifying that for everyone. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing here. So, picking up where we left off, Roger Williams just got back to Salem. And it was only a matter of months before the Bay Colony authorities got word that he was back in their vicinity. And you may be sure it was no glad tidings to their ears. Over the past few years, their original rift with him had grown worse rather than healed, for during his stay in Plymouth, Roger had published a tract, which a tract is just kind of a short pamphlet, on the matter of taking land from the Indians. The tract had spread quite widely among the newly sprung settlements, and had even reached to Boston. And the leaders were not pleased with it. Roger was seldom one to mince his words, and this tract was no exception. He had plainly called King James I a liar, said the Royal Charter of Plymouth was a fraud, and that the colonists should reconsider what they had done in not paying the Indians for their land. And by implication, of course, saying that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was also a thieving sham. While Roger had been in Plymouth, the Bay Colony leaders could do nothing. But now that this outlandish preacher was in the area of their control, they wasted no time in pouncing upon him. That very December, Roger was called to come before the General Court, for that is what the group of leaders had agreed to call themselves. The court demanded that Roger defend and explain these foolish ideas of Indian land rights to them. Certainly it was a rather touchy meeting. Not much is known concerning the details of the proceedings, but in the end, the tract disappeared from common view. We know that Roger certainly didn't change his belief that taking the land from the Indians was wrong, but perhaps the wish to live at peace with all men had driven him to compromise and retract his written words. Whatever the case, even if Roger had done this in the interest of peace was not a virtue to be had. He was simply too different and too outspoken. More and more issues of doctrine and practices of the church came up over the following months. For one, there were fierce debates over whether the English St. George's Cross flag should be displayed in the churches, since some believed it was a popish invention. The General Court didn't believe this was the case. They actually punished one man, named John Endecott, for cutting a flag down and destroying it, and then promptly blamed Roger for instigating the event. There were smaller disagreements too, for instance, whether women should cover their heads in church or not, an issue on which Roger took a positive stance. And then, of course, ever foremost for Roger were the issues of enforcing the first table of the law and the stealing of land from the Indians. Of course, he had kept to his agreement and refrained from publishing written material on the latter subject, but he would nonetheless not remain altogether silent. Roger's duties increased twofold in August of 1634, with the death of good Mr. Skelton. He was naturally chosen to fill the vacancy as shepherd of the Salem flock. The General Court watched in grim silence as this preacher of troublemaker fame stepped up to his new position. They would bide their time. for now. The next year, in July 1635, the leading men in Salem decided they wanted to add more land to their township. The adjoining tract of land known as Marblehead had particularly caught their eye. And just to give you an idea of what's going on here, here's Salem on a map, and here's Marblehead, the land that they're wanting to annex. But, of course, nothing could be done without approval from the leaders in Boston, and so a petition was duly presented to them. Well, unbeknownst to the honest Salemites, this was just the chance the General Court had been waiting for. Yes, of course you can have Marblehead, came the reply, so congenial at first. Under one condition. You must fire Mr. Williams. The Salemites were quite taken aback. What kind of bargaining was this? This was clearly treading on their privileges as an independent church. You have no right to control who we choose as a pastor, they returned angrily. This has nothing to do with the land. But the General Court refused to reason with them. In fact, they refused to even listen to them. In desperation, the Salemites wrote up a letter protesting this infringing of their rights and sent it to the surrounding churches. But just as soon as the letters were out, the General Court snatched them up, and they were never read publicly as they were meant to have been. And not only this, but now the Salem representatives were banned from attending future government meetings. All because of one man who dared to be different. Roger was called to the court that month, and again demanded to answer for his opinions, as they were termed, though we would much rather prefer to call them beliefs. The General Court sternly told him that his ideas were wrong, dangerous even, and commanded him to stop spreading them among the people. Roger was grieved that he should be the cause of so much trouble for his little congregation. He assumed the role of peacemaker once more, and officially resigned as pastor. Though, you mustn't believe that he stopped preaching. Oh no, peacemaking didn't mean cowardice, and it certainly didn't mean giving up. He left that courtroom that July with the words of the apostles ringing in his ears. We ought to obey God rather than men. He simply started his own little church in the warmth and rugged cheerful comfort of his home. But even here, withdrawn from public spotlight and secluded in humble simplicity, there was no room for peace. Inklings of the light of truth that shone from his lips still constantly reached the ears of the General Court, and they simply couldn't stand it. Within 3 months, another summons from Boston arrived at the Williams home. Roger was to appear before the court again, this time under the heavy, ominous charges of sedition and heresy.